The door of the small shop burst open before dawn, and Elena Whitfield dropped the needle from her hand. A man stood in the frame, breathing hard, his coat soaked from the rain, his eyes moving fast across every shelf and every shadow in the room. He did not say good morning. He did not ask permission. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him as if he were being chased. "Where is the gray coat?" he said. "The one with the torn sleeve. It was left here 2 nights ago." Elena's heart began to beat faster than it should for such a simple question. She had mended that coat herself, late at night, by candlelight, and while running her fingers along the lining to check the stitching, she had felt something hard and round hidden inside the fabric. She had pulled it free without thinking. It was a ring, heavy and gold, with a crest she did not recognize pressed into its surface. She had hidden it in the small wooden box under her workbench and told no one, not even her mother. Now a stranger stood in her shop asking for that very coat, and something in his voice told her this was not an ordinary question about lost clothing. "The coat is here," she said carefully, reaching for the garment hanging near the window. But there was nothing unusual about it. The man's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand trembled slightly at his side. "Nothing unusual," he repeated. "Are you certain, girl?" Elena had grown up in the fishing town of Ashford Cove, where honesty was as common as salt in the air, and lying did not come easily to her. But something about this man's urgency, the way his eyes kept darting to the door as though he feared being followed, told her to be careful with the truth. "I checked the lining and the pockets before I began my work," she said. There was nothing inside. The man studied her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself to hold his gaze without blinking, though her pulse pounded in her ears. Finally he turned, grabbed the coat from her hands without paying a single coin, and walked back out into the rain without another word. Elena locked the door behind him and stood there, shaking, for several long minutes. Her mother, Cora, called from the back room, asking who had come at such an hour, and Elena did not know how to answer. She only knew that the ring hidden beneath her workbench was far more dangerous than she had first believed, and that the man who had just left would not be the last person to come looking for it. She waited until the shop was quiet again before she opened the wooden box and studied the ring under the morning light. It was heavier than any ring she had ever touched, made of gold that had darkened slightly with age, and the crest pressed into its face showed a hawk with its wings spread wide above a crown. She had seen crests like this before, though only from a distance, on the carriages that occasionally passed through Ashford Cove on their way to the capital city of Rosemere. This was not the ring of a merchant or a farmer. This was the ring of someone connected to the royal court. Her mother appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, her face still soft with sleep. "Elena, who was that man? You look pale as the moon." "It was nothing, Mother. A customer confused about his order." Cora frowned, unconvinced, but she did not press further. She had learned over the years that her daughter carried worries quietly, working through them in her own time, the same way she worked a difficult stitch until the fabric lay smooth and even. Cora returned to the kitchen, and Elena sat alone with the ring resting in her palm, turning it slowly, watching the candlelight catch on the engraved hawk. She thought about selling it. The thought came honestly, without shame, because she and her mother had little money, and Cora's cough had grown worse with each passing winter. A ring like this, sold quietly to the right buyer in a larger town, could pay for medicine, could pay for warmer coats, could ease the fear that lived constantly behind her mother's eyes whenever the cold months arrived. Elena was not a thief. She had found the ring by accident, hidden in a coat left for repair, and no one would ever know if she chose to keep it. But the stranger's visit changed everything. If someone was searching this urgently for a ring hidden in a torn coat, then the ring was not simply valuable. It was important to someone, perhaps important enough that its disappearance had already caused trouble for other people. Elena did not know the full story yet, but she understood enough to know that keeping the ring might bring danger not only to herself, but to her mother as well. She decided she needed more information before she did anything at all. That afternoon, she walked to the harbor where the fishing boats came in, and she asked casual questions of the men unloading their catch. Had anyone seen a nobleman staying nearby? Had any strange carriages passed through recently? The fishermen laughed at first, teasing her for asking about lords and ladies, but one older man, a weathered sailor named Godfrey, mentioned that a fine carriage had stopped at the old manor house on the hill 3 days earlier, and that the man who stepped out of it had given a false name to the innkeeper, though Godfrey's cousin worked in the stables, and had overheard the coachman using a different name entirely when he thought no one was listening. "They called him Lord Hale to his face," Godfrey said, "but the coachman called him something else. Edmund something. though I did not catch the rest." Elena thanked him and walked back toward the shop with her mind racing. A nobleman traveling under a false name, staying quietly at the manor house, and a coat left for repair with a hidden ring bearing a royal crest. The pieces did not fit together cleanly yet, but she felt certain now that the man in the gray coat and the man at the manor house were the same person, and that he had a reason powerful enough to hide his true identity from an entire town. That evening, as she sat by the fire mending a torn hem for a neighbor, her mother finally asked the question Elena had been dreading. "You have been distracted all day, Elena. Tell me what troubles you." Elena hesitated, then decided that her mother deserved at least part of the truth. She retrieved the ring from its hiding place and placed it in Cora's weathered hand. Her mother's eyes widened as she turned it over, feeling the weight of it, studying the crest with the careful attention of someone who had spent a lifetime noticing details in fabric and thread. "This is no ordinary ring," Cora said quietly. "Where did you find this?" "In the lining of a coat left for repair. A man came looking for it this morning, though he did not say so directly. He frightened me, Mother. There is something wrong here, something bigger than a lost piece of jewelry." Cora was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weariness of a woman who had faced hardship many times before and had learned to weigh her words carefully. "We could sell this, Elena. You know we could. It would ease so much for us, and no one would ever trace it back to this house." "I know," Elena whispered. "But that is not what you want to do, is it?" Elena looked at the ring resting in her mother's palm, at the hawk with its wings spread wide, and she thought of the stranger's trembling hands, the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with greed, and everything to do with something he could not afford to lose. Whatever this ring meant, it clearly mattered deeply to someone, and Elena could not shake the feeling that returning it honestly was far more important than any coin it might bring. "No," she said finally. "I want to find out who it truly belongs to, and I want to return it myself." Cora studied her daughter's face for a long moment, and then, to Elena's surprise, she smiled, though sadness lingered behind it. "You have always been like this, even as a small child. Do you remember the coin you found on the road when you were 7, and how you walked 3 miles to return it to the merchant who had dropped it, though we had barely enough bread that week?" Elena nodded, the memory returning with warmth despite the tension of the moment. "I worried then that your honesty would leave us hungry," Cora continued. "I still worry about it now, but I have never once been ashamed of you, Elena, not for a single day of your life. If you believe returning this ring is right, then I will not stand in your way, even if it frightens me." Elena took her mother's hand, the ring resting between their palms, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind picked up along the coast, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below the manor house on the hill. Somewhere up there, a man was hiding his true name and searching desperately for something he had lost, unaware that the person who held it was already deciding to give it back. Elena did not sleep well that night. She lay awake going over every possibility, every danger that might come from walking up to the manor house and revealing what she had found. The stranger who had come to the shop clearly worked for someone, and his fear suggested that failure to recover the ring would bring consequences neither of them wanted to face. If she approached the wrong person, or if word spread before she understood the full situation, she might put herself and her mother in far greater danger than simply staying quiet and forgetting the ring existed at all. But forgetting was no longer possible. The ring sat heavy in its box beneath her workbench, and every time she closed her eyes she saw the hawk crest pressed into gold, and she felt the pull of a decision that would not let her rest until it was made. By the time the sun rose over Ashford Cove, painting the harbor in soft orange light, Elena had made up her mind completely. She would not sell the ring, and she would not hide from the truth of what she had found. She would walk to the manor house herself, and she would return the ring to the man who called himself Lord Hale, whoever he truly was, and she would do it with her own 2 hands, without asking for anything in return. She only hoped that her courage would be enough to carry her through whatever waited for her at the top of that hill. The path up to the manor house wound through thick trees that blocked most of the morning light, and Elena walked it quickly, her hands buried in her shawl, the wooden box holding the ring pressed tightly against her chest beneath her cloak. She had told her mother she would be back before midday, though neither of them truly believed that promise. Something about the previous morning's encounter told Elena that nothing about this situation would be quick or simple. She had almost reached the iron gate at the top of the hill when a hand closed around her arm from behind a hedge, pulling her sharply off the path. Elena gasped and spun around, ready to run, but found herself face to face with a young man dressed in dark traveling clothes, his expression urgent rather than threatening. Do not go up there, he said quietly. Not yet. Not until you tell me why you are carrying that box so carefully against your chest. Elena's breath caught. Who are you? My name is Nathaniel Gray. I serve the man staying in that house, though not in the way you might imagine. He glanced nervously toward the gate, then back at her. You spoke to him yesterday, did you not? At the shop in the village. He came looking for something. How do you know that? Because I am the one who told him where to look, Nathaniel said, and because I have spent the last day trying to protect him from people who wish to find that same thing before he does. Elena's grip tightened around the box beneath her cloak. Every instinct told her to run, yet something in Nathaniel's eyes held a kind of desperate honesty that matched her own. He was afraid, but not of her. He was afraid for someone else. Explain yourself, she said, or I will turn around right now and forget I ever came here. Nathaniel glanced once more toward the manor, then guided her further behind the hedge, out of view from the windows above. His voice dropped low. The man you met is not truly called Hale. His name is Edmund, and he is a duke of the royal court in Rosemere. He came to this coast in secret because he is searching for something that was lost many years ago, something that belonged to the Queen's late brother, Prince Edwin. Elena felt a chill move through her despite the warmth of the morning sun. The ring, she whispered. Nathaniel's eyes widened. You have it. She did not answer immediately, weighing whether trusting this stranger was wise. But he had approached her with warning rather than force, and his fear seemed genuine in a way that fear rarely was when faked. I found it hidden in a coat left at my mother's shop for repair, she admitted. I did not know what it meant until the man came looking for it yesterday. Nathaniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then you must understand how much danger you are in simply by holding it. Prince Edwin died 8 years ago, supposedly from a fall while riding along the northern cliffs. But Edmund has never believed that story, and neither has the Queen, though she has never been able to prove otherwise. The ring vanished the night of the prince's death, and its return has been searched for ever since, quietly, without the public ever learning the truth. Why would a ring matter so much? Because it is not simply a ring, Nathaniel said. Inside the band, hidden beneath the crest, there is a small mechanism, a tiny compartment built by the royal jeweler. Prince Edwin used it to hide a folded note, something he wrote in his final days, something he trusted no one to read except his sister. If that note still exists inside the ring, it may finally reveal what truly happened to him. Elena's mind spun as she tried to absorb everything Nathaniel was telling her. The ring in her possession was not simply a lost piece of jewelry belonging to a nobleman. It was evidence, carefully hidden, that someone had gone to great lengths to recover, and clearly someone else had gone to equally great lengths to keep hidden. Who else is searching for it? She asked. Nathaniel's expression darkened. There is a man at court named Lord Callum Ashby, an advisor who has served the crown for many years, and who stood closest to Prince Edwin on the night he died. Edmund has long suspected Ashby played some part in what happened, though he has never had proof strong enough to accuse a man of his standing. If Ashby learns that the ring has resurfaced, and that a note from the prince himself may still be hidden inside it, he will do everything in his power to make certain it never reaches the Queen. The man who came to my shop, Elena said slowly. Was he working for Ashby? I do not know for certain, Nathaniel admitted, but it is possible, which is why you must be extremely careful about who you trust from this point forward, myself included, until you have reason to believe otherwise. Elena stood quietly for a moment, absorbing the weight of everything she had just learned. What had begun as a simple discovery in the lining of a torn coat had grown into something far larger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. A missing prince, a grieving queen, a powerful advisor who might have played a role in a death disguised as an accident, and at the center of it all, a small gold ring, now hidden beneath her cloak, close enough to her heart that she could feel its weight against her ribs with every breath. I still intend to return it, she said finally. To Edmund, and through him, to the Queen. That has not changed. Nathaniel studied her with something like admiration. Most people, upon hearing what I have just told you, would run in the opposite direction and never look back. Most people did not grow up watching their mother struggle every winter, while still teaching her daughter that honesty matters more than comfort, Elena replied. I did not ask for any of this, but I will not turn my back on it now that I understand what is at stake. Nathaniel nodded slowly, seeming to reach a decision of his own. Then I will help you reach him safely. But we cannot simply walk through the front gate. If Ashby has eyes watching this house, and I believe he does, then a stranger approaching directly will draw far too much attention. We must find another way in. He led her along a narrow trail that curved around the side of the hill, staying low beneath the tree line, moving carefully and quietly in a way that told Elena this was not the first time he had needed to move unseen. As they walked, he explained more of what he knew. Edmund had left the capital in secret, telling only a handful of trusted people where he had gone, after receiving a tip that the missing coat, and possibly the ring within it, had last been seen somewhere along this stretch of coast. He had been searching the local shops and inns for 3 days, growing increasingly desperate as time passed, fearing that Ashby's own men might reach the ring first. "The man who visited your shop yesterday morning," Nathaniel said. "Describe him to me again." Elena did her best, recalling the stranger's soaked coat, his trembling hands, the way his eyes had darted toward the door as though he feared being followed himself. Nathaniel listened carefully, his jaw tightening with each detail. "That does not sound like one of Ashby's men," he said finally. "Ashby's men are cold and controlled, trained to show no fear even when threatened. The man you describe sounds frightened, perhaps someone caught between 2 dangerous sides, trying to recover the ring for reasons of his own protection, rather than loyalty to anyone. Do you think he will return?" "I think we should assume he might, which is exactly why we need to move quickly." They reached a small side door built into the stone wall of the manor house, half hidden behind climbing vines, and Nathaniel knocked in a specific pattern before it creaked open from within. A servant girl, no older than Elena herself, peered out cautiously before recognizing Nathaniel and stepping aside to let them pass. Inside, the manor was quiet and dim, lit only by narrow windows and the occasional candle. Elena followed Nathaniel down a corridor lined with old portraits, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she walked, until they reached a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. Nathaniel knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. The door opened, and Elena found herself standing face to face with the man she had lied to only a day earlier, though now, seeing him in the low candlelight of the manor rather than the frightened stranger who had burst into her shop, she noticed things she had missed before. His clothes, though simple, were well made, in a way that spoke of quiet wealth rather than obvious display. His eyes, though tired, held an intelligence and steadiness that suggested a man used to carrying heavy responsibilities without complaint. "You," he said, recognizing her immediately. "You told me there was nothing in the coat." "I lied," Elena said simply. "I am sorry for that. I did not know then whether I could trust you." Something shifted in his expression, surprise mixing with cautious hope. "And now?" Elena reached beneath her cloak and drew out the small wooden box, holding it steady despite the trembling she felt in her own hands. "Now I have come to return what belongs to your family, my lord, and to whatever truth it might help reveal." Edmund stared at the box for a long moment without moving, as though afraid that reaching for it too quickly might cause it to vanish like something from a dream. Nathaniel stepped back respectfully, giving them space, while Elena stood quietly, waiting, feeling the full weight of the past 2 days settle over her like a heavy coat of her own. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves approaching along the coastal road, and none of them yet knew how little time remained before the danger Nathaniel had warned about would arrive at the manor's front gate. Edmund finally reached out and took the box from her hands, his fingers steady despite the emotion visible in his face. He opened it slowly, and when the candlelight caught the gold of the ring inside, he let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 8 long years. "I had begun to believe I would never find it," he said quietly, almost to himself. "My sister has not slept peacefully since the night my father passed, and she took the crown. Not truly. Not since Edwin died, and left this question unanswered. If there is any truth hidden within this ring, she deserves to know it, whatever that truth might be." Elena watched him turn the ring over in his fingers, studying the hawk crest with an expression that mixed grief and hope in equal measure. She thought of her own mother, waiting anxiously back in the village, and felt a small pang of guilt for how long this errand had already taken. But she also felt something else, something warm and unfamiliar, the quiet satisfaction of having done exactly what she believed was right, regardless of the danger it had brought. That satisfaction did not last long. A sharp knock echoed against the front door of the manor, 3 heavy strikes that carried through the stone walls and silenced the room instantly. Nathaniel's head snapped toward the corridor, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of a short blade at his belt. "That is not the household staff," he said quietly. "They know to use the side entrance." Edmund closed the box swiftly, tucking it inside his coat, and moved toward the window that overlooked the front drive. What he saw made his jaw tighten. 3 riders sat on horseback near the gate, their cloaks dark and unmarked, deliberately hiding any crest or symbol that might identify who they served. One of them dismounted and approached the door while the others remained mounted, watching the surrounding grounds with the careful attention of men trained to notice anything out of place. "Ashby's men," Nathaniel said grimly. "How could they have found us so quickly?" Elena whispered, her pulse racing. "The man who visited your shop," Edmund said, his voice low and urgent. If he reported back to whoever sent him, even without finding the ring himself, it may have been enough to draw attention to this coast, and eventually to this house. We do not have much time. Elena's mind raced through everything Nathaniel had told her only an hour earlier. Ashby's men were dangerous, methodical, willing to do whatever was necessary to prevent the Queen from learning the truth about her brother's death. And now 3 of them stood outside the very door of the house where the ring, and the truth it might contain, currently rested. "There is a passage beneath the kitchen," Nathaniel said quickly, already moving toward the door. "It leads down through the old wine cellar and out to the cliffs above the shore. It was built generations ago, in case the house ever needed to be evacuated quickly. Follow me, both of you, now." Edmund grabbed Elena's arm gently but firmly, guiding her out of the room and down the corridor at a pace just short of running. Behind them, she heard the muffled sound of voices at the front entrance, the household steward attempting to delay the visitors with polite but firm questions about the purpose of their visit. It would not hold them for long. They reached the kitchen, where the servant girl who had let them in earlier stood frozen with alarm, and Nathaniel quickly explained that they needed the cellar passage. She nodded without hesitation, and led them to a heavy trapdoor hidden beneath a woven rug near the hearth. Nathaniel lifted it, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. "Go," he said. "I will delay them as long as I can, and follow when it is safe." "Nathaniel, they will suspect you if you stay behind," Edmund said, concern flashing across his face. "Then I will give them a story to believe," Nathaniel replied, already moving back toward the front of the house with a calm confidence that Elena found both reassuring and deeply unsettling. "Go. Protect the ring. Protect her. That matters more right now than my own safety." There was no time to argue. Edmund guided Elena down the stone steps into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor shut behind them, plunging them briefly into total darkness before he produced a small lantern from a hook near the entrance and lit it with practiced hands. The flickering light revealed a narrow tunnel lined with old wine racks, cobwebs, and the damp smell of earth that had not seen sunlight in a very long time. "This way," Edmund said, leading her forward through the passage. They moved quickly, the lantern light bouncing off the stone walls, Elena's heart pounding with every step as she strained to hear any sound of pursuit behind them. The tunnel sloped gradually downward, the air growing cooler and saltier as they went, until finally she could hear the distant crash of waves against rock, growing louder with each passing minute. "Where does this lead exactly?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, despite the distance already put between them and the manor above. "To a hidden cove along the cliffs," Edmund answered. "There is a small boat kept there for emergencies, though I confess I never imagined I would need to use it quite like this." They emerged finally from the tunnel into a narrow opening in the cliff face, the late morning sun blinding after the darkness of the passage, the sound of waves now thunderous against the rocks below. A weathered wooden boat sat tied to a small dock built into a sheltered inlet, hidden from view unless one already knew exactly where to look. Edmund helped Elena down toward the dock, his eyes scanning the cliffs above them constantly for any sign of movement. As they reached the boat, a shout echoed from somewhere above, faint but unmistakable, followed by the sound of hooves on stone. "They found the passage," Edmund said grimly. "Nathaniel must have run out of ways to stall them. Will he be safe?" Elena asked, fear tightening her throat. "Nathaniel has talked his way out of far worse situations than a few questions from Ashby's men. Trust in that, and trust that we must move now if we hope to keep this ring, and whatever secret it holds, out of their hands." They climbed into the small boat, Edmund working quickly to untie the rope while Elena watched the cliff edge above them with growing dread. A figure appeared at the top, silhouetted against the bright sky, and even from this distance she could see him point directly toward the cove where they now sat. "They have seen us," she said urgently. "Then we row," Edmund replied, pushing the boat away from the dock and taking up the oars with strong, practiced strokes. The boat cut through the choppy water as shouts continued from the cliff above, though Elena could not make out the words over the crash of waves and the pounding of her own heart. She glanced back once and saw 2 riders had reached the shoreline near the tunnel entrance, though the rocky terrain seemed to be slowing their pursuit, buying precious time as Edmund rowed them further from the cove and out into the open water beyond. "Where are we going?" she asked, gripping the edge of the boat as it rocked with each wave. "There is a fishing village further along the coast, smaller than Ashford Cove, less likely to be watched. From there, we can secure horses and travel inland toward the capital, by a route that avoids the main roads. It will take longer, but it will be safer." Elena nodded, though her mind remained on Nathaniel, left behind at the manor to face Ashby's men alone. She thought of his calm confidence as he sent them down into the tunnel, the way he had spoken of protecting the ring, and protecting her as though his own safety mattered less than their success. She hoped fiercely that his cleverness would be enough to see him through whatever conversation awaited him back at the house. They rowed for nearly an hour before Edmund finally guided the boat toward a small stretch of rocky shore, far enough from the cove that no pursuit seemed to have followed them across the open water. He helped Elena climb out onto the rocks, both of them soaked from sea spray and breathing hard from exertion and lingering fear. "We should rest here only briefly," Edmund said, glancing back the way they had come. "Ashby's men will not give up easily once they realize the ring has slipped from their grasp again." Elena sat on a flat rock, catching her breath, and finally allowed herself to ask a question that had been building since Nathaniel first explained the situation to her behind the hedge that morning. Why does this note matter so much? Even if Prince Edwin wrote something before his death, what could possibly be worth risking so much to prevent it from reaching the Queen? Edmund sat down beside her, pulling the small wooden box from his coat and opening it once more to study the ring within. "Edwin was not simply my cousin. He was meant to be a great reformer, someone who believed the court had grown too comfortable with corruption, too willing to look away from injustice as long as the treasury remained full. He had begun gathering evidence in his final months, quietly, carefully, evidence that certain advisors close to the crown had been diverting funds meant for the northern villages into their own private holdings. And Lord Ashby was one of those advisors. We believe so, though we have never had proof strong enough to bring against a man of his influence. If Edwin's note names names, if it confirms what we have long suspected, it could finally give the Queen the evidence she needs to remove Ashby from power and restore what was stolen from the people he was meant to protect." Elena absorbed this, understanding now the true weight of what she carried, or rather, what Edmund now carried in his coat. This was no longer simply a story about a missing ring and a grieving family. It was about justice for villages far poorer than her own, families who had likely suffered through winters even harder than the ones she and her mother had endured, all because of greed hidden behind the polished manners of the royal court. "Then we cannot let them stop us," she said firmly. Edmund looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between gratitude and quiet admiration. "You have already risked more for this cause than most people at court have in their entire lives, Elena. I will not forget that, whatever happens next." They did not have long to rest. The distant sound of hooves on the coastal road above the rocks reminded them both that Ashby's men, though slowed, had not given up the pursuit. Edmund helped Elena to her feet, and together they began making their way along the shoreline toward the small fishing village he had mentioned, moving quickly and staying low along the rocks wherever possible, to avoid being seen from the road above. The journey took the better part of the afternoon, winding along narrow paths between the cliffs and the sea, until finally the rooftops of a small village came into view, smoke rising gently from chimneys, fishing boats bobbing in a quiet harbor untouched by the danger that had chased them from Ashford Cove. Edmund led her toward a modest inn near the water, where he spoke quietly with the innkeeper, an old friend from years of quiet travels along this coast, arranging for horses and provisions to be ready before nightfall. As they waited in a small back room, away from windows and prying eyes, Elena finally allowed herself to feel the full exhaustion of the day, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline that had not yet fully faded. Edmund noticed and offered her a cup of warm tea the innkeeper had brought, along with a look of genuine concern. "You did not ask for any of this," he said quietly. "I want you to know that I understand the sacrifice you have made today, and that whatever happens next, you will not be forgotten in this story, no matter how it ends." Elena wrapped her hands around the warm cup, thinking of her mother waiting back in Ashford Cove, likely worried sick by now, and thinking too of Nathaniel, left behind to face danger on their behalf. "I only hope Nathaniel is safe, and that this note, whatever it says, is worth everything it has already cost." "So do I," Edmund replied softly. "So do I." Outside, the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red, and somewhere behind them, along the winding coastal road, Ashby's men continued their search, unaware that their quarry had already slipped further ahead than they realized, carrying with them a truth that had waited 8 long years to finally see the light. Night had fully settled over the fishing village by the time Edmund and Elena set out on horseback, the innkeeper having provided 2 sturdy mounts along with dried food and a lantern to guide their way. The road they took was not the main route toward Rosemere, but a quieter inland path used mostly by traders moving goods between smaller villages, far less likely to be watched by anyone searching for a duke and a seamstress traveling together. They rode mostly in silence at first, both exhausted from the events of the day. The only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the distant call of night birds settling into the trees along the roadside. Elena had never ridden more than short distances before, and her legs ached with the unfamiliar strain, but she said nothing, determined not to slow their progress with complaints. It was well past midnight when Edmund finally suggested they stop to rest the horses near a small stream, the moon casting silver light across the water as they dismounted. While the horses drank, Edmund pulled the small wooden box from his coat once more, studying it thoughtfully in the moonlight. "I have been afraid to open it properly," he admitted quietly. "As long as the note remains hidden, there is still hope that it contains the answer we need. Once I look, that hope becomes either confirmed truth or crushing disappointment." Elena sat beside him on a flat stone near the water's edge. "You do not have to open it now, if you are not ready." "No," Edmund said, shaking his head slowly. "I think I need to know, before we reach the capital, before Ashby's men have any further chance to intercept us. If there is nothing useful inside, we must adjust our plans accordingly." He examined the ring carefully under the moonlight, running his fingers along the inside of the band until he found what he was searching for, a nearly invisible seam hidden beneath the crest itself. With careful, steady pressure, he pressed a small hidden catch, and the compartment clicked open, revealing a tightly folded piece of paper no larger than a fingernail, yellowed slightly with age. Elena watched as Edmund unfolded it with trembling hands, holding it close to the lantern light to make out the faded handwriting within. She waited in tense silence as his eyes moved across the words, his expression shifting from anxious anticipation to something closer to grief, mixed with vindication. "It is here," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Edwin names him directly. Ashby, along with 2 other advisors, diverted funds meant for flood relief in the northern villages 3 years running, hiding the theft behind falsified reports. Edwin discovered it during an audit he conducted quietly, without informing the full council, fearing exactly what eventually happened to him." "Does it say what happened the night he died?" Edmund's jaw tightened as he read further. "He writes that he confronted Ashby directly, believing the man might still be reasoned with, might still choose to correct his wrongdoing rather than face exposure. He was wrong to trust that mercy would be shown to him." Edmund's voice dropped lower. "The final lines simply say that if anything happens to him before he can bring this evidence before the Queen, he trusts whoever finds this ring to finish what he started." Elena felt a heavy silence settle between them, the weight of 8 years of unanswered grief, finally given words, finally given proof. She thought of Queen Margaret, who Nathaniel had said still had not slept peacefully since her brother's death, and felt a fierce determination rise within her that this note would reach the palace no matter what stood in their way. "Then we finish what he started," she said firmly. Edmund looked at her, something like renewed strength returning to his tired eyes. "Yes, we do." They mounted their horses once more and continued through the night, the note now carefully refolded and returned to its hidden compartment, the ring itself wrapped securely in cloth and tucked deep within Edmund's coat. As dawn began to break over the hills ahead, painting the sky in soft pink and gold, they spotted smoke rising from a small crossroads settlement, where several roads converged on their way toward the capital. It was there, while pausing briefly to water the horses at a public well, that Elena spotted a familiar figure standing near the edge of the settlement, watching them with an expression of nervous recognition. It was the same man who had burst into her mother's shop 2 mornings earlier, still wearing the same soaked coat, though it had since dried and grown wrinkled from travel. "That is him," she whispered urgently to Edmund, "the man from my shop." Edmund's hand moved instinctively toward the blade at his belt, though he did not draw it, instead watching carefully as the man approached them slowly, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "Please," the man said, his voice shaking, "I mean you no harm. I only wish to explain myself before you judge me too harshly." "Speak quickly then," Edmund said, his tone guarded but not hostile. The man introduced himself as Peter Farlow, a former groundskeeper who had once worked at the manor house, years before Edmund's family had acquired it, and who had fallen into debt after a difficult harvest season left his own small farm struggling to survive. Ashby's agents had approached him weeks earlier, offering to clear his debts entirely in exchange for locating a specific coat rumored to have passed through the coastal villages, a coat that Ashby's network had traced from a stable boy who had once worked briefly for Prince Edwin himself, years before his death. "I did not know what the coat truly contained," Peter admitted, shame evident in his voice. "I was told only that it belonged to a nobleman, and that its return would be generously rewarded. When I could not find it, and when Ashby's men grew impatient with my failure, I feared for my family's safety. and so I continued searching desperately, hoping to find it before they decided I had failed them entirely. And now? Elena asked. Why approach us openly instead of continuing your search in secret? Peter's eyes flickered toward the wooden box visible beneath Edmund's coat. Because I saw the riders who passed through this crossroads not 2 hours ago, moving fast toward the Capitol Road, and I recognized them as Ashby's men from the Manor House pursuit. I realized then that whatever I find no longer matters, because they already know the ring has resurfaced, and they are moving to intercept it before it reaches the palace. I came to warn you, not to steal from you. I want no further part in whatever cruelty Ashby intends. Edmund studied the man carefully, weighing the sincerity in his frightened eyes against the very real danger his warning suggested. How far ahead are they? 2 hours. Perhaps less by now, riding hard toward the western gate of Rosemere. If you continue on this road, you will likely encounter them before you ever reach the city walls. Elena felt her stomach tighten with renewed fear. They had already survived one close escape, and now it seemed a second, potentially more dangerous confrontation waited somewhere ahead on the very road they needed to travel. Is there another way into the city? Edmund asked. Peter hesitated, then nodded slowly. There is an older road less traveled that approaches from the southern hills instead of directly west. It adds perhaps 3 hours to the journey, but it would avoid the western gate entirely, bringing you instead near the merchant district, where a nobleman's arrival would draw far less immediate attention. Edmund glanced at Elena, and she nodded firmly, understanding without words that the longer, safer route was clearly the wiser choice despite the additional time it would cost them. Thank you for this warning, Edmund said to Peter. I will not forget the courage it took to come forward and admit your part in this, especially knowing the risk it carries for you and your family. I only ask that you speak on my behalf, if it should ever come to that, Peter said quietly. I have a wife and 2 young children who depend on me, and I fear what Ashby's men might do once they realize I have abandoned their service. Come with us instead, Elena said suddenly, surprising even herself with the offer. If Ashby's men suspect you of betrayal, staying here alone leaves you exposed. Traveling with us, at least until we reach the capital, offers you protection you would not otherwise have. Edmund considered this for a moment before nodding in agreement. She is right. We could use another set of eyes watching the road behind us, and I would rather see you safely delivered to the palace guard than left here to face Ashby's retribution alone. Peter's relief was visible, tears briefly welling in his tired eyes, before he wiped them away, and nodded gratefully. Within minutes, he had secured a horse of his own from the crossroads stable, and the 3 of them set off together along the southern road Peter had described, moving with renewed urgency as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. The southern route proved just as demanding as Peter had warned, winding through steep hills and narrow forest paths that slowed their progress considerably, but it offered the advantage of near total isolation, with no sign of Ashby's riders anywhere along the way. As they rode, Peter shared additional details about Ashby's operations at court, information that Edmund listened to carefully, recognizing the value of testimony that might corroborate the evidence hidden within Edwin's note. By late afternoon, the towers of Rosemere finally came into view, rising above the distant hills, the palace itself visible even from this distance, its white stone walls catching the sunlight like something out of a dream Elena had never imagined she would see up close. She thought of her mother back in Ashford Cove, likely frantic with worry by now, and felt a pang of guilt mixed with determination to see this journey through to its end, before finally returning home. We are close now, Edmund said, urging his horse forward with renewed energy. Once we reach the palace and this evidence is placed before my sister, everything changes, for Ashby, for the northern villages he wronged, and hopefully, for you as well, Elena. Though I confess I do not yet know how the crown could ever properly repay what you have risked these past 2 days. Elena said nothing in response, watching the distant towers grow larger with each passing mile, uncertain what awaited her within those palace walls, but certain of one thing above all else. Whatever came next, she had done what she believed was right, and that certainty carried her forward through the exhaustion, the fear, and the uncertainty that still lay ahead on the final stretch of road toward Rosemere. The merchant district of Rosemere buzzed with the noise of a city Elena had only ever imagined from stories told by traveling peddlers who passed through Ashford Cove. Carts rattled over cobblestone streets, vendors called out prices for fresh bread and dyed cloth, and the air carried a mixture of smells entirely foreign to the salt and fish scent of her home village. Under different circumstances, she might have paused to marvel at it all, but Edmund kept their pace brisk, weaving through the crowded streets toward the palace gates with Peter riding close behind them. They had nearly reached the outer courtyard when a familiar voice called out from a side alley, causing all three of them to stop abruptly. Edmund, thank the heavens. Nathaniel emerged from the shadows, his clothes torn and dusty, a fresh cut visible along his temple, but very much alive and moving under his own strength. Relief flooded through Elena at the sight of him, and even Edmund's usually composed expression broke into something close to open joy. How did you get here ahead of us? Edmund asked, dismounting quickly to grip Nathaniel's shoulder. I convinced Ashby's men that the coat and its contents had already been sold to a traveling merchant heading south, toward the border, rather than admit anyone had passed through the tunnel, Nathaniel explained, wincing slightly as he touched the cut on his head. They did not entirely believe me, and things grew tense before I managed to slip away during the confusion of their search through the cellar. I have been riding hard ever since, hoping to reach the palace and warn the household guard before you arrived, in case Ashby's men reached the western gate first. They did, Elena said. Or at least, they were riding toward it when Peter warned us in time to take the southern road instead. Nathaniel's eyes shifted to Peter with visible surprise, and Edmund quickly explained the circumstances of their unexpected ally's arrival. Nathaniel listened carefully, then nodded with grudging respect. Then it seems we have all played our part in getting this far, he said. But we are not safe yet. Ashby has spies within the palace itself, servants and guards loyal to him rather than the crown. If word reaches him that you have arrived, even within these walls, he may attempt something desperate before the Queen ever learns the truth. Then we move quickly and quietly, Edmund said, his expression hardening with resolve. I know a private entrance used by family members that avoids the main courtyard entirely. If we can reach my sister directly, without alerting the wider court to our presence, we remove Ashby's opportunity to interfere. They left the horses with a stable hand Edmund trusted from years of quiet visits home, and made their way on foot through a series of narrow servant passages that wound behind the main palace structure, Nathaniel leading despite his injuries, having apparently used this route himself on prior visits. Elena's heart pounded with every turn, uncertain what might wait around each corner, but grateful for the confidence of the men guiding her through unfamiliar territory. They were perhaps 50 paces from the private entrance when a figure stepped out from a side corridor, blocking their path entirely. Elena recognized him immediately from Nathaniel's earlier description, though she had never seen him before this moment. Lord Callum Ashby stood before them, dressed in fine dark robes befitting his station, his expression calm and controlled despite the clear surprise flickering briefly across his features at the sight of them. Edmund, Ashby said smoothly, his voice carrying none of the urgency that had marked his men's pursuit along the coast. I had heard rumors you left the capital rather abruptly. I trust your travels were productive. You know exactly what my travels involved, Edmund replied, his tone icy. Step aside, Ashby. This matter no longer concerns you privately. It concerns the crown. Ashby's eyes moved briefly to the shape of the small box visible beneath Edmund's coat, and something cold flickered behind his otherwise composed expression. I do not know what you believe you carry, but I would advise caution before making accusations you cannot substantiate. Careless words spoken against a longtime advisor of the crown could have serious consequences for those who speak them. Is that a threat? Nathaniel asked sharply, stepping forward despite his injuries. It is simply advice, Ashby said calmly, though his eyes never left the box beneath Edmund's coat. Advice I would extend to anyone foolish enough to trust the ramblings of a dead man's final letter over the testimony of those who have served this kingdom faithfully for decades. Elena felt a chill at his words, realizing he already knew far more about what they carried than his calm demeanor suggested. Ashby's gaze finally shifted to her, studying her with cold curiosity. And who is this young woman traveling in such distinguished company? Surely not simply a servant, given the way she stands beside a duke of the realm as though she belongs there. She is the reason this evidence still exists at all, Edmund said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Elena, as though to shield her from Ashby's scrutiny. She found what your men failed to recover, and she chose honesty over the fortune it might have brought her. That is more integrity than this palace has seen from certain advisors in a very long time. Ashby's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack in his composed exterior. You are making a grave mistake, Edmund. Whatever fantasy you believe that letter contains, presenting unverified accusations before the Queen will only embarrass this family further. Reopening wounds better left closed. Let my sister decide that for herself, Edmund said, moving forward decisively. Step aside, Ashby, or I will summon the palace guard and explain exactly why a senior advisor attempted to block a member of the royal family from reaching the Queen's private chambers. For a long, tense moment, Ashby did not move, his eyes calculating something behind his composed expression, weighing options Elena could not begin to guess. Finally, with visible reluctance, he stepped aside, though the cold fury in his eyes suggested this was far from a genuine surrender. "Very well," he said quietly. "But mark my words, Edmund, this is not finished, whatever you believe that letter proves." They moved past him quickly, Nathaniel keeping a wary eye on Ashby until they had turned the final corner toward the private entrance, uncertain whether he might still attempt something desperate before they reached the Queen's chambers. But no further interference came, and within minutes, a palace attendant who recognized Edmund immediately ushered them through a series of increasingly grand hallways toward the private wing where Queen Margaret conducted her most personal affairs. The attendant disappeared briefly to announce their arrival, leaving the group waiting in a quiet antechamber decorated with portraits of past monarchs, including one that Elena immediately recognized as a younger version of the Queen, standing beside a boy, who could only have been Prince Edwin, both of them smiling in a way that suggested a happier time before tragedy had reshaped their family's story. The doors finally opened, and Queen Margaret herself stepped into the antechamber, her presence immediately commanding despite her simple attire, clearly having been interrupted from private business rather than formal court proceedings. Her eyes found Edmund first, relief and concern mixing across her tired features. "Edmund, where have you been? Your absence has caused considerable worry these past days." "Forgive me, sister," Edmund said, bowing slightly before continuing. "I have been following a lead regarding Edwin's ring, and I believe I have finally found not only the ring itself but the truth we have searched for since his death." The Queen's expression shifted instantly, years of guarded composure cracking to reveal raw hope and fear intertwined. "You found it? After all this time?" "I did not find it alone," Edmund said, turning to gesture toward Elena. "This young woman, Elena Whitfield, discovered the ring hidden within a coat left for repair at her family's shop along the coast. Rather than sell it for the fortune it might have brought her, she chose to seek out its rightful owner, risking considerable danger in the process to see it returned honestly." Queen Margaret's gaze turned fully toward Elena, studying her with an intensity that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the moment settling heavily over the small antechamber. "You could have kept it," the Queen said finally, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the silent room. "You could have sold it, and no one would have ever known the difference." "I considered it, Your Majesty," Elena admitted honestly, unwilling to pretend the temptation had never existed. "My mother and I have faced difficult winters, and the fortune such a ring might bring would have eased much hardship. But something about it felt wrong to keep, as though it belonged to a story far larger than my own need, a story that deserved to reach its rightful conclusion." The Queen's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she turned back to Edmund. "And the note? Does it still exist within the ring?" Edmund carefully removed the small wooden box from his coat, opening it to reveal the ring resting within, and beside it, the tiny folded note that had traveled such a dangerous distance to finally reach this room. "It does, sister. And I believe it finally answers the question that has haunted you these past 8 years." Queen Margaret took the note with trembling hands, unfolding it slowly, her eyes moving across her late brother's handwriting for the first time since his death. Elena watched as the Queen's expression shifted through disbelief, grief, and finally a kind of fierce, quiet fury that suggested the true weight of what her brother had written. "Ashby," the Queen whispered, her voice barely audible yet carrying an intensity that filled the entire room. "All these years he stood beside me, offered condolences, pretended grief he never truly felt, while carrying this secret the entire time. We encountered him only minutes ago in the palace corridors," Edmund said grimly. "He attempted to discourage us from bringing this evidence before you, though he did not explicitly deny its contents." The Queen's expression hardened into something regal and formidable, the grieving sister transforming visibly into a monarch prepared to act decisively. "Summon the palace guard immediately. Lord Ashby is to be detained for questioning regarding matters of treason against the crown, effective this moment. He is not to leave these palace grounds." A nearby attendant hurried to carry out her orders, and the Queen turned back to Elena, her expression softening once more, though the fire of righteous anger still burned visibly behind her eyes. "You have given me something I feared I would never receive," she said quietly. "Not simply my brother's ring, but the truth of what happened to him, and the chance to finally see justice done on his behalf. I do not know how to properly express what that means to me." "You owe me nothing, Your Majesty," Elena said, feeling suddenly small and uncertain beneath the weight of royal gratitude. "I only did what felt right." "That is precisely why it matters so deeply," the Queen replied. "In a court filled with people who calculate every action for personal advantage, you risked everything you had for a stranger's ring, simply because honesty demanded it of you. That kind of integrity deserves recognition, not dismissal." Word of Ashby's detainment spread through the palace with remarkable speed, and within hours, the full court had gathered in the Grand Hall, summoned by royal decree to witness a formal announcement regarding matters of significant importance to the crown. Elena stood nervously at the edge of the gathered nobility, feeling entirely out of place amid silk gowns and polished manners, with Edmund and Nathaniel standing supportively nearby, Peter having been given quiet assurance that his own role in events would be handled with appropriate discretion and protection. Queen Margaret entered the hall with regal composure, taking her place upon the throne at the head of the room, the assembled court falling silent with practiced deference. She spoke first of Lord Ashby's betrayal, of funds stolen from villages desperately in need, of a young prince silenced for daring to expose the truth, and the room reacted with visible shock and murmured outrage as the full weight of the scandal settled over the gathered nobles. Then, unexpectedly, the Queen's gaze shifted toward Elena, standing quietly at the edge of the Grand Hall. None of this truth would have come to light, the Queen said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, were it not for the honesty and courage of a young woman who owed this crown nothing, who stood to gain everything by staying silent, and who chose instead to do what was right. Elena felt every eye in the hall turn toward her, her cheeks flushing with sudden, overwhelming self-consciousness, as the weight of royal attention settled upon her entirely. "Elena Whitfield," the Queen continued, "please step forward." With trembling legs, Elena made her way through the parted crowd toward the throne, uncertain what was expected of her, her heart pounding louder than it had even during the desperate flight from Ashby's men along the coastal cliffs. She reached the base of the throne and offered a hesitant curtsy, unsure of proper court etiquette, but determined to show the respect the moment clearly demanded. What happened next, Elena would remember for the rest of her life with perfect clarity. Queen Margaret rose slowly from her throne, an act that visibly startled the assembled court, murmurs rippling through the Grand Hall at the extraordinary sight of their monarch standing to honor a common seamstress from a small coastal village. The Queen descended the few steps separating her from Elena and, with the entire court watching in stunned silence, took Elena's hands in her own. "You returned my brother's ring, without asking for anything in return," the Queen said, her voice thick with emotion that carried clearly through the silent hall. "You said nothing of reward, nothing of recognition, when you placed it in my brother's coat pocket at the manor house days ago. Your silence spoke louder than any words could have, and it is only right that this kingdom now honors that silence with the recognition it so deeply deserves." Elena stood frozen, overwhelmed by the moment, as the Queen turned to address the full court once more. "Let it be known throughout this kingdom that Elena Whitfield of Ashford Cove has performed a service to the crown that few nobles in this very hall could claim to match. From this day forward she and her family shall want for nothing, and her name shall be remembered in the royal records as an example of the honesty and integrity this kingdom hopes to see reflected in all its people, regardless of birth or station." The Grand Hall erupted into applause, the assembled nobility rising to their feet in acknowledgement of the Queen's declaration, and Elena stood at the center of it all, tears finally slipping free, as the exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty of the past several days gave way to overwhelming, disbelieving joy. She thought of her mother, waiting back in Ashford Cove, and felt a fierce longing to share this moment with the woman who had taught her, from childhood, that honesty mattered more than any fortune the world might offer in exchange for silence. Edmund watched from the edge of the hall with quiet pride, Nathaniel beside him grinning despite the lingering pain of his injuries, both of them having played their part in bringing this moment to fruition, though neither sought the recognition now falling entirely upon the young woman who had started this entire journey with nothing more than an old coat and an honest heart. The weeks that followed passed in a blur Elena could hardly believe was real. Lord Ashby's trial before the Royal Council lasted only 3 days, the evidence against him overwhelming once palace investigators began examining the financial records he had spent years carefully falsifying. Prince Edwin's note, combined with testimony from Peter Farlow and several northern village leaders who came forward once they learned the truth might finally be exposed, painted a picture too damning for even Ashby's considerable influence to overcome. He was stripped of his title and his lands, the stolen funds ordered returned to the northern villages that had suffered under his greed for so many years, and he was sent to live out his remaining days far from the capital, under permanent watch, forbidden from ever holding public office again. Peter Farlow, rather than facing punishment for his initial involvement in Ashby's search, was instead granted a small pension by the Crown, in recognition of the courage it had taken to abandon that service, and warn Edmund and Elena of the danger waiting along the western road. He returned to his farm with enough support to finally clear his debts and provide properly for his wife and 2 children, and he sent word to Elena months later that his family had never known such peace and security, a gift he credited entirely to the moment he chose honesty over continued fear. Nathaniel's injuries healed within a few weeks, and Queen Margaret personally saw to it that his loyalty and cleverness during the entire ordeal did not go unnoticed. He was offered a permanent position within the palace guard, a role he accepted with quiet pride, though he often visited Ashford Cove in the months that followed, claiming official business that somehow always seemed to coincide with occasions when Elena happened to be visiting the harbor. As for Elena herself, the Queen's declaration proved to be no empty gesture. A modest but comfortable sum was granted to her family, enough to finally ease her mother's winters, enough to expand the small shop into something far more substantial, and enough to ensure that neither of them would ever again face the anxious calculations of whether medicine or bread mattered more in a difficult month. Cora Whitfield wept when Elena first returned home and explained everything that had happened, holding her daughter tightly, as though afraid the entire adventure might have been nothing more than an elaborate dream. "I always knew your honesty would matter more than any fortune," Cora said through her tears, "but I never imagined it would matter quite like this." Elena laughed despite her own exhaustion, the sound feeling foreign after days filled with fear and danger, yet deeply welcome in the familiar warmth of her mother's kitchen. "Neither did I, Mother. I only wanted to do what felt right." Word of Elena's story spread throughout the kingdom in the months that followed, carried by traveling merchants and court gossip alike, transforming her from an unknown seamstress into something of a quiet legend among the coastal villages. Children in Ashford Cove began telling the story to one another, each retelling adding small embellishments until Elena herself barely recognized the tale as it eventually made its way back to her own ears. She found this both amusing and slightly uncomfortable, never having sought fame or recognition for simply doing what she believed anyone in her position should have done. Edmund visited Ashford Cove himself several times over the following year, ostensibly to check on the progress of the expanded shop the Crown's generosity had helped fund, though Elena suspected his visits carried purposes beyond simple oversight. Their conversations during these visits grew easier and more comfortable with each passing month, the formal distance between Duke and seamstress gradually softening into genuine friendship, built upon the trust they had forged during those dangerous days along the coast and the road to Rosemere. Queen Margaret, for her part, found a measure of peace she had not known since her brother's death, finally able to properly honor his memory, once the truth behind his passing had been fully acknowledged before the entire court. She commissioned a small memorial garden within the palace grounds, dedicated to Prince Edwin, and included within its design a subtle engraving of a hawk with wings spread wide, the same crest that had once marked the ring hidden so carefully within a torn coat lining. She invited Elena to the garden's dedication ceremony, a quieter affair than the grand hall announcement months earlier, attended only by those who had played meaningful roles in finally bringing the truth to light. Standing beside that memorial garden, watching afternoon sunlight filter through newly planted trees, Elena reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since the morning she first discovered a hidden ring while mending a stranger's coat. She thought of the fear she had felt when Peter Farlow first burst through her shop door, the uncertainty of deciding whether to trust Nathaniel behind that hedge, the desperate flight through the tunnel beneath the manor house, and the overwhelming moment when Queen Margaret herself had risen from her throne to honor a simple village seamstress before the entire royal court. None of it had happened because Elena sought glory or fortune. It had happened because, faced with a choice between easy silence and difficult honesty, she had chosen the harder path, trusting that doing what felt right mattered more than the immediate comfort that dishonesty might have provided. That choice had rippled outward in ways she never could have anticipated, touching the lives of northern villages long denied justice, restoring peace to a grieving queen, and ultimately transforming her own family's fortunes in ways that felt almost impossible to fully comprehend even now. Her mother's shop, expanded with the Crown's support, became known throughout the region not simply for quality craftsmanship, but for the story attached to its humble beginnings. Young women from neighboring villages sometimes traveled considerable distances simply to see the place where Elena Whitfield had once discovered a ring that changed the course of a kingdom's history, and Elena found herself, somewhat reluctantly, becoming something of a mentor to those who asked how she had found the courage to act as she did during those frightening days. "I was not brave in the way people imagine," she often told them honestly. "I was frightened nearly the entire time, uncertain whether I was making the right choice, worried constantly about what might happen to my mother if things went wrong." Courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing to do what felt right despite that fear, one small decision at a time, until eventually those decisions led somewhere I never could have planned or predicted. As the seasons turned and years passed, Ashford Cove itself began to change gradually, its economy strengthened by increased trade following the exposure of Ashby's corruption and the subsequent reforms Queen Margaret implemented throughout the kingdom's financial oversight. The northern villages that had suffered under years of stolen relief funds finally received the support they had long been denied, their recovery serving as a lasting testament to the consequences that flowed from one honest choice made in a small coastal shop. Elena never forgot the weight of that ring resting in her palm on the morning she first discovered it, nor the fear in Peter Farlow's trembling hands as he pleaded for information about a lost coat, nor the desperate flight through darkened tunnels and open water that followed. But more than the danger, she remembered the quiet certainty that had guided her through each difficult decision, the simple belief instilled by her mother since childhood, that honesty, however costly in the moment, ultimately mattered more than any fortune gained through silence or deception. Years later, when children in Ashford Cove asked her to tell the story of the Duke's ring and the Queen who rose from her throne to offer thanks, Elena would smile and begin the same way each time, reminding her young listeners that the story had never truly been about rings or crowns or royal recognition at all. It had always been, from that very first morning, about the simple, sometimes difficult choice to do what felt right, regardless of what easier paths might have offered instead. And in the end, she would tell them, that choice had been worth every moment of fear it had cost her along the way, because it had led not only to justice long overdue, but to a life she never could have imagined for herself, built upon the unshakable foundation of a promise she had made to herself in the quiet hours before dawn, standing alone with a stranger's ring resting heavy in her open palm.